Buzzkillers, it's me, it's the old professor here, once again busting myths and taking names, and I'm with Dr. Charles Spicer, all the way from the UK via the internets to help us study something, or to help us better understand the pre-war period in Britain. And he's done it in a remarkable way with a great book called Coffee with Hitler. Dr. Spicer, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, this is such an interesting book for all sorts of reasons, not just because it has one of the best titles, I think, ever for a serious book, but it's all about various attempts during the 1930s and well before the war starts to, as you say, attempt to civilize the Nazis. The subtitle of the book is The Untold Story of the Amateur Spies Who Tried to Civilize the Nazis. I didn't know anything about this, and of course, the vast majority of people don't know about this. Tell us a little bit about, first of all, how you got attracted to, or how you found out about, and then how you got attracted to this little group of people as a possible topic for a good book.
Well, I was looking at the history of some Liberal MPs from in the 1920s and 30s, a handful of whom, most famously David Lloyd George, who'd been First World War British Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, who'd gone out to see Hitler. And while there's a certain amount written about those meetings, the background wasn't well described. And I discovered that they were all involved with an organization called the Anglo-German Fellowship, which was set up in 1935. And when I looked into that, and it has a Wikipedia entry, there's a certain amount about it on, in books, but no one's done it in any detail. It was very much represented as being something on the very far right of British politics. So having members of the Conservative Party, but at the very extreme right. And he was essentially lumped together with Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists and the other very unsavory pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler, anti-Semitic organizations. And this didn't tie in with these liberals who were members. And I looked into it. I tracked down the membership list and did a proper analysis as part of my doctorate as to what made up the membership, and discovered that actually they were much more mainstream. And it was very embedded in the British establishment. And therefore, I could see there was something a bit wrong here.
You mean wrong in the sense that the notion that the Anglo-German Fellowship was all a bunch of, as you say, Mosley, the Mitfords, and other appeasers, that it's more rich. There's something else going on here.
Exactly. And that there wasn't an archive, although I've tracked down an awful lot of papers related to it. But it was a detective job to do that. Great fun. The problem was it was a mainstream organization up until the point when it's inevitable that we're going to go to war with Germany.
Right.
At which point you can imagine the sound of tearing paper as people ripped up their membership cards pretty quickly. And
yeah.
I mean, to give you context, this organization was funded by the cream of British business. So Imperial Chemical Industries, Unilever, which is the big manufacturer of butter and margarine and everything, soap. Huge British organizations funded it. All of the main British banks supported it, all the investment banks. Its money and its energy came initially from the business world, who just didn't want a second war.
But the book is actually focused on a certain relatively small group of individuals within that fellowship. It's not about Nancy Mitford. It's not about not specifically about these big businessmen. It's about people who actually went over and tried to civilize the Nazis, sort of meet with them socially, play on their Anglophilia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That seems, first of all, an amazing act of diplomacy / spy game / intelligence work that, as I said at the very beginning, I hadn't thought even existed.
Yeah, I think initially what I try and map out in the book, in the early days, they genuinely thought there was a very good chance of preventing war between Britain and Germany. And they got the financial backing from big business to do that. And they wanted to help prevent war by encouraging more business. And Germany was Britain's biggest trading partner on the continent in 1935 in any event. and the Nazis had now been in power for a couple of years, people were pretty puzzled. They thought, we've got to get to know these people. We've got to understand them. Better have them inside the tent than outside the tent. And so they were genuinely trying to make friends and civilize in that sense. It wasn't about appeasing, which is a complex, as you know better than me, is a complex set of diplomatic strategies.
Mm-hmm.
But where the book pivots is that because they got to know them so well, they actually figured out earlier than the British government that the Nazi regime was irredeemable, that
Right.
Hitler was on a path to hell. By that time, they had all these structures in place. They had clubhouses in Berlin. They had 15,000 Germans coming over and being toured around the UK. They had all these connections, and they built very personal relationships, particularly with Hermann Goering, Joachim Ribbentrop, Rudolf Hess, and also with Hitler himself. And so they had these personal relationships. So they were getting this excellent first-hand intelligence. One of the things about the Nazis, they were so in awe of the Brits that they couldn't help but show off, tell them exactly how many planes they were building per week and all that good stuff, and what their strategy was for Czechoslovakia, for Poland, for Austria. And they just shared this information with their newfound friends who, rather than, when they realized that that war was inevitable, rather than closing it down and taking their bull home, as it were, they realized that they should keep it going pretty much until the last minute. And they just funneled all this information back to initially the British Foreign Office, but then increasingly straight into the British cabinet and straight to the British Prime Minister. And it was astonishing how this group of amateurs were giving better information than the Secret Intelligence Service and the Foreign Office. And effectively, they start working together on all this.
Yes, but then they also get to the point where there is this sort of socializing aspect that they realize is in itself important. And that in itself, there's a chance, in theory, that we can try to talk them out of things, or try to at least talk them away somewhat from their extremism. And so the whole coffee with Hitler idea, or the coffee with the Nazis idea, is the more we have these sort of social engagements, and the more we try to civilize them through our civilized manners, the less likely they are to become extreme. Now, Buzzkillers, this is all before Kristallnacht. This is all before things get really serious. It's an amazing sort of coffee shop diplomacy.
Yes, and food and drink have been key diplomatic tools for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And it's easy to forget that. And it's very easy for contemporary commentators or historians to look back on it and just say, shame on you. Why was a liberal MP breaking bread with Nazis? How could they do that? But, if you look at the modern days, our late Queen had Putin come and stay in Buckingham Palace. They sent a carriage with horses to pick him up from the train station. Our Prime Minister took President Xi of China down to the pub. This still happens. If you're a democratic politician, you have to break bread with people whose regimes you might not approve of.
And what evidence do we have of the sort of conversations that they had while they were breaking bread? I mean, I know that they can't. I know that the records don't exist of them saying, "Well, I talked so and so out of building 50 more bombers." But what sort of things were we able to find out about the way these intelligence officials, or not even officials, amateurs, were able to see Nazi ideology getting worse and worse and worse?
Oh, we actually, it took quite a lot of digging, because, this is a 10-year project. But we actually have transcripts of conversations. So particularly the key meeting, which is where we get the title from, where Lloyd George goes with one of the heroes of my book, a man called Philip Cromwell Evans, goes with Lloyd George to meet Hitler, who's accompanied only by Paul Schmidt, who's his interpreter. So you've just got the four of them. And Cromwell Evans typed up his notes of that conversation immediately afterwards. And I found the original transcript amongst his papers when I finally found his papers. So we have a pretty good idea about how Lloyd George challenged Hitler. And unlike Churchill damned him, his friend, and they were good friends, Churchill and Lloyd George, but he damned him for having, as being naive. But actually, Lloyd George was pretty brave with Hitler. He took him on, particularly around, certain of his obsessions. He didn't tackle at that point the Jewish question. But other people who went out did, including my three protagonists, who are otherwise obscure individuals who I've sort of like to think I've resuscitated in public eye. And they did consistently and all the way through the book. And I'm not apologizing for them, because clearly in the early days they were guilty of some forms of naivety. But they consistently tried to persuade their Nazi friends that their treatment of the German Jews, and that's what we are talking about at this stage, pre-Kristallnacht, as you rightly point out, was appalling on many different levels and was not helping their cause. Bad for business, as well as being morally wrong. And Lloyd George made that quite clear when he was interviewed by the newspapers immediately after his meeting.
Well, let's talk about these three individuals, because, as you say, you have resuscitated them back from the sort of forgotten, dusty archives. Who were they?
Well, there's three, and they're very disparate, although I suppose they're all middle-aged males. But you have a historian called Philip Conwell Evans from a very humble background. And he was a political secretary, son of a tailor from Wales, clearly super bright, because he got himself to Oxford and then got a doctorate at the London School of Economics and never made any money, was always a lifelong bachelor, always living quite modest accommodation. But in the end, he advised 5 British prime ministers on German strategy, not all while they were in office, because he worked with Lloyd George, he worked with, particularly close to Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, then Chamberlain, and then he meets 2 or 3 days before war is declared, he meets with Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, who were both future prime ministers. So he was recognized amongst these circles as being the man who understood the regime better than anyone else. And he's almost been completely forgotten by history. Although people know he was the 4th man in the room in the Hitler-Lloyd George meeting, he normally gets a paragraph. And a lot of historians who tried to track him down just couldn't find out much about him. I think he very much operated in the shadows. And his story became something of a sort of personal fascination to me.
And then, who's the second one?
And then his close friend is Graham Christie, Group Captain Graham Christie, CMG DSO MC, who was a fantastically well-decorated and successful First World War fighter ace. One of the first people to engage in powered flight, because he bought his own plane in 1912, so a couple of years before the First World War. He was a wealthy engineer who'd studied in Germany. And during the First World War, he flies all the way through, starting off as a second lieutenant, ending up as a group captain and lieutenant colonel. So he has this great career, very modest, painfully shy, another lifelong bachelor. He ended the First War with what we would now define as PTSD, I think. I mean, you know, his nerves.
Yeah.
Because he flew combat all the way through the war, even when, you know, he was way too senior. They didn't want him doing that. He's the first person to do tactical bombing in the Battle of the Luce. So a hero, a John Buchan character, Richard Hannay from the John Buchan books, if you're familiar with those. That's sort of something out of a novel rather than real life. And in the 20s, he comes to the States and he's the air attaché at the British Embassy in Washington. In the first half of the 20s. In the second half of the 20s, he does that same job in Germany. And in both jobs, he spies for his government. And he was so popular in the States, as an aside, that the American authorities got very nervous because the American aviators and aircraft engineers were sharing information, even though we were sort of allies, had reasonably friendly terms. They didn't necessarily want all these. He was very good at getting people to open up. And he did that in Germany in the 20s. But he early on realized, well before they came into power, that the Nazis were an existential threat. He retires in 1930 and sets himself up, I think uniquely, as a self-funded, independent intelligence agent living on the Dutch-German border and gathering all this information of what's happening in Central Europe and particularly Germany. He becomes very close friends with Hermann Goering, who's commander of the Luftwaffe, who respects him because they're both fighter aces. And you get this sort of supranational relationship. If you're a distinguished aviator, national principles, rather in the same way someone said, nowadays astronauts will all have a supranational relationship. These guys were sort of superheroes of their day. So he sort of spies in plain sight. He's not stealing information. He's not breaking any laws. He's just going around and persuading people to show him around their aircraft factories and having long whiskey drinking sessions. And he reports all the way through to the head of the British Foreign Office, who is very skeptical, Sir Robert Vansittart, and they build this great bond. And his papers exist in one of the Cambridge colleges, in Churchill College, Cambridge archive, and are a fascinating resource. And he and Cromwell Evans basically become like sort of mini detective agency, the two of them. And then the third character is called Ernest Tennant, who's completely different in that he's a very wealthy, successful businessman. The Tennant family were the people who, his ancestor invented bleaching powder, which turned into ICI, which was the biggest chemical company in the world at one point, probably in the mid-20s. So this guy's fantastically wealthy, and he organizes the business backing, and he founds the Anglo-German Fellowship and builds a very close relationship with Joachim Ribbentrop, who goes on to become the German ambassador in London, and then obviously fantastically, disastrously becomes the Third Reich's foreign minister.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a good place. We're about halfway through. It's a good place for us to take a break, Buzzkillers, because we need to pay the bills and bow to our corporate overlords. And when we get back, we'll talk more with Dr. Spicer about what this triumvirate actually did on the ground in trying to, quote, civilize the Nazis. So back in a moment. Okay, we are back, Buzzkillers, with Dr. Charles Spicer here, who's here talking to us about his great book, Coffee with Hitler, which I should have mentioned at the very beginning of the show, won the Spectator and Telegraph. Both of them have History Books of the Year awards, and you won both of them. That must have been very pleasing.
Very gratifying.
Yes, well, I think one of the reasons it's important that these books win awards is because you are helping to deepen our understanding of what was going on in the 1930s in Britain in terms of relations with Germany. Well, before we left, you explained to us who the three main protagonists in your book were. Now, let's talk a little bit about what they did in Germany and what they, more importantly, what they tried and ultimately failed to do. So let's do it, if you don't mind, chronologically. Remember, we've got Hitler coming to power in 1933, and everybody knows that there's something very, very different going on in Germany. This isn't a surprise. People, the soundbite version of history is that Hitler seizes power, which is not true, and that all of a sudden the world is shocked. But what do these three protagonists then do in the mid-30s as the Nazis are starting to become more and more powerful?
Well, just to set the context from a British perspective, the astonishing thing is that Hitler had been in power, and obviously we all know that how he got into power has a lot wrong about it, but he was at least ostensibly the legitimate head of state of the biggest economy and the biggest society and country on the continent. No British politician went to see him for 2 years. They were quite happy to go to see Mussolini. There were other dictators. In fact, there were very few democracies, as you know. So people sort of looked down on the Germans and on Hitler in particular. They saw him as this low-caste Austrian corporal. They didn't think he was going to last. They didn't bother with him diplomatically, good or bad. And my trio wanted to correct that. And they thought if the professionals won't do it, they had to do it on an amateur basis or a quasi-amateur basis. So they start the organization in late 35. And they take some business guys over and they meet with Hitler and his economics advisor. But really, it's 1936 when it kicks off. And that, in a way, was the high point of their schmoozing. And they bring a host of British politicians out, initially for the Olympics. So you've got the Berlin Olympics in June 36. They bring out 100 members of parliament, members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords with their wives. And they're feted. There's great parties laid on. As you know, you've probably talked about it before. Hitler cleans up his act, but is made to look much more friendly. All the evidence of some of the atrocities are removed. and they want to look like a modern state that's welcome to foreigners, open to business. And a lot of people fall for this. It's very well executed propaganda. It's very difficult, I think, wrong for any of us to say we wouldn't have fallen for it. It wasn't as blatant as people sometimes make out. And then that's immediately followed by the Lloyd George meeting, which we talked about before the break. And then you get the Nuremberg rally, which happens every year in September in the Nazi era up until the outbreak of war. And again, they bring out quite a substantial party of the great and the good. And they get to meet and get entertained by all of the senior Nazis who throw big parties. And these are elegantly done, not some of the sort of vulgar things that they've been known of before. The Nazis are very keen to appear civilized. So Hitler puts on white tie and tails. He hates it, but he feels very uncomfortable and very difficult to track down the photographs. You can find one or two, but he didn't want to be photographed. He wasn't comfortable looking like a penguin, if you put it. He preferred being in uniform. But they really roll out the red carpet, pretty much literally, for these British aristocrats, senior businessmen, and senior politicians.
And do we know how well these three are received in Germany, or at least do we know how far they're able to get close to people they need to convince to try to change their evil ways, or
I mean,
is
very,
it all
very close? I mean,
okay.
So Tennant and Cromwell Evans, when they're out there, they will stay with Ribbentrop in his villa in Dahlem. So they're entertained personally. They have personal relationships. They consider themselves friends. And that friendship continues when Ribbentrop moves to London to become the ambassador. Goering and Graham Christie, they exchange New Year letters. I've tracked down their telegrams to each other wishing Happy New Year. So this is a personal relationship. This is just, half an hour and a quick cup of coffee, notwithstanding the title of the book.
Yeah.
They build a relationship where they can raise these difficult subjects, particularly the Jewish question, and they have rows. So we have the record of a row between Cromwell Evans and Ribbentrop. So absolutely fascinating. Ribbentrop was very thin-skinned. So they were prepared to talk truth to power.
And they kept doing so, but unfortunately, this doesn't, it should say, ultimately, it's not very effective. At what stage do they start to realize that, no, things are eventually going to slide to eventually Kristallnacht?
That's the interesting thing, and this is what I argue in my book, is earlier than people have ever given them credit for. So really, second half of 1937, and relevantly, much earlier than Neville Chamberlain, much earlier than the British cabinet. So there's this wonderful irony, because the British government has been sniffy about the German regime, cautious, failed to engage, not quite sure what to make of it. And these guys in the early days are saying, you really must try and befriend these people. They get ignored. They realize the errors of their ways. And then suddenly the British government says, we really must try and get to know these guys. And my lot are saying, it's too late. You've blown it.
Right.
And
they're saying that by late 37.
They're starting to get seriously worried by then. And because they're having regular meetings with Hitler, and he is becoming a lot less friendly and a lot more, he rant, he's doing in meetings, he did these rants where he'd start obsessing about, more often about the Bolsheviks and the Russian threat, and everyone's out to get Germany, the sense of encirclement. He's doing that piece. And they realize he's becoming increasingly unpersuadable, irrational. And also they realize how energetically he and Goering are rearming and really shifting the economy onto a military footing.
But then, as we say, and as you point out clearly in the book, Kristallnacht happens, and it's almost as if that is the point at which the British government finally realized that this trio was right all along.
Exactly. And here I rely on Sir Martin Gilbert, Churchill's official biographer, but also a very distinguished historian of the Holocaust, and himself Jewish, who's wrote a really good, quite slim book called Kristallnacht. And in that, he says it's pretty straightforward. Up until Kristallnacht, if you're arguing for appeasement or civilizing or whatever we want to call it of the Nazi regime, you're almost certainly wrong, but you might be forgivable. Whereas there was nothing hidden about Kristallnacht. It was reported in every single international newspaper. It so happened there were a lot of journalists. It was inexcusable But, Chamberlain was still trying to appease, not because he had any sort of sympathy towards it, but he was still trying to appease well into early 39. But my guys were appalled by that, and they realized, and as you know, it was really done to brutalize the German populace, who prior to Kristallnacht, they weren't interested in war. When Chamberlain turns up, pretty dull guy, and they treat him like a rock star, the German public.
Yeah. Well, and then as we all know, then there's Munich, and then there's the invasion of Poland, and then there's the war. But I don't want to skate over that, because what I want Buzzkillers to do, of course, is to get the book and read that section. There's so much more detail in the book than we're talking about. But one of the other interesting aspects about this story, about the story of these three men, but also about the Anglo-German Fellowship in general, is what happens to them after the war. Because despite, especially for these three, despite their intentions and despite the fact that they're actually ahead of the government and ahead of public opinion and right about all these things earlier on, they sort of, I don't say they have to go into hiding, but they sort of have to, well, they can't exactly advertise, hey, I was one of the people who went over and wined and dined these Nazis. They lived well into the 1970s. This is a long time to have to live with being characterized as, quote, one of the guilty men, that famous book in 1940. What was their life like after the war?
Well, can I answer the question a little bit earlier? During the war, because, they're all three of them are too old to serve. Tennant does sort of home guard and things like that, but they're not going to be on active service. But they had this, particularly Cromwell Evans and Christie, who were both very fluent German speaker, had huge knowledge. And they offered their services to Churchill's government, and they weren't properly used. One or two bits and pieces, a little bit of intelligence work, liaising with struggling resistance to Hitler. But because, as you rightly say, people who had associated, and so many Brits had been over to Germany, they were stigmatized. Everyone was, those scrapbooks were all being hidden in the back cupboard. They weren't properly used. And then, as you say, post-war, they have to live with this shadow hanging over them and this misconception, unbalanced perception of what contribution they may or may not have made.
And then how do they they don't get rehabilitated really until your book, but how do they sort of live out their lives?
It's a good question. Ernest Tennant's got plenty of money. He retires to his lovely Essex house. He remarries his first wife, who does get very interested in right-wing politics. She threatens to expose him or publicize his pre-war interaction with the Nazis. So he decides to, what would be a modern term, you get ahead of the story. He actually publishes a memoir, which I think was actually quite well received, called True Account, where he explains his interactions. And it was a very useful resource for me, as you can imagine. Cromwell Evans and Christie, they also write this extraordinary book called None So Blind. They write it during the war. They have it printed by the King's printer, beautiful, very high quality piece of work. And they only have 100 copies made. And those books are hidden in a bank vault for 20 years and are not distributed until they're both dead. And they basically expose the British government for not having listened to the warning signals that they should have listened to.
Right. This is absolutely fascinating. And we're going to put links to this sort of stuff on the blog post for this episode. And there's so much more in this book, Buzzkillers, that you need to read and you need to understand. But one final thing, Dr. Spicer, how does this help us understand the 30s in general? And I don't want to say appeasement, because that has almost a universally bad connotation now. But how does this help us more broadly understand attempts to stop Hitler or come to terms with Hitler and maybe, divert him just enough to prevent the war from happening, or at least, let's say, the well-intentioned attempts? Do we understand these people better, or is it possibly to become more sympathetic with what they're trying to do rather than simply call them all Chamberlainite weaklings?
Absolutely, I think so. It's I've written the book. It's a narrative history book. I try and leave as an introduction and conclusion, but I try and leave my readers to come to their own view on those sort of moral judgments. But how most people have fed back to me, and what I think is, you read the story, And you give them credit for being much better intentioned and much more intelligent and much more resourceful than people might have realized. You just have a sense of a whole series of missed opportunities.
Yes.
And I'm certainly, there are many schools of history of the 1930s, but I don't think that Hitler's rise to power and launching of the Second World War and maintaining that war for 6 years, I don't see any of that as inevitable. There were so many opportunities to knock him off course. Particularly, there's the Oster conspiracy in 1938. We got tantalizingly close to deposing him. There were a number of people who would have liked to have replaced him, not least of which Goering, who probably would have taken the regime in a different direction. And so, this was all worth trying. I sometimes say tongue in cheek, I'm afraid the book, it's a bit like that film Titanic. We do know what happens in the end.
Yes, well, yeah.
And Churchill was still looking for alternatives in the days leading up to the war. Even, he's often one of the myths, which, and you're the champion mythbuster, this idea that Churchill was always the warmonger and was always convinced that the only way to stop Hitler was with total war. That just isn't true. Just isn't supported. And he was very honorably exploring alternatives right up until the days before war is declared. And he described the Second World War to your President Roosevelt as the unnecessary war in, I think, 1946. That wouldn't have been 46. Roosevelt's dead by then, 44.
Well, yeah. So, yeah.
He calls it the unnecessary war. That's really one of the key themes in my book, is how might it have been avoided?
Well, and I think when you read this, Buzzkillers, you will understand that, all this stuff is so much more rich, so much more complicated than we thought before. And it's important to try to understand the complications and not just take the History Channel, soundbite view these things. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Dr. Spicer, so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Professor, for having me. It's been great fun.
And Buzzkillers, the book, of course, is on the Buzzkill bookshelf for you to get right away and read and to help further your understanding of not only World War II, but 20th century history. So we will talk to all of you out there next week.